We shall sit here stationary until we are live. We are live.
Welcome to With Thunderous Applause, a podcast where two friends talk about current events and the ideas that will shape our uncertain future. I am your host, Steve, along with my co-host and producer, Zach. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing pretty good. Had weird, rainbow squiggly shit in my eye earlier. So it's probably a stroke. I don't think so. I didn't smell toast, or diabetes. And
That's
looking down, that's
cool.
The more likely culprit.
Could it possibly be twisted? You know how they say that once you drop acid, you can re-trigger an acid trip. I've heard that's bullshit.
Yeah.
But maybe you just moved away and cracked your back and
I've never taken acid
mild
before.
microdose.
I've never taken it before. That would be cool though.
Oh, you've never dropped acid?
No, just mushrooms.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It
Fair
just
enough.
never
I
came
mean,
up.
you really didn't. You went straight from high school into the military, and you didn't even start smoke weed for the first time until
after I was out of the military.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, it's
not for lack of my friends trying.
We were, recreationally taking opiates, and while we went skiing, and we dropped acid and ate mushrooms and all sorts of shit, all recreational.
Of course.
But acid's fun. My hippie neighbor actually was like, "Oh man, I've had this acid in the freezer for decades, and I remember taking it a long time ago, and it's awesome." And once the weather cools down, because he said this in the summertime, he's like, "We should just go up to the park and drop acid." And then it got cold and wet, so we're like, "It's not pleasant now to drop acid."
Isn't that fucking amazing? Finally got some wetness in California.
We did. That's a fucking news story. We should do a whole story on water.
You know what it was? Is Cardi B came through the area.
Is that it?
It's the only explanation.
Doesn't she sing a song about moisture?
Yeah. Regional moisture. Excessive.
In the southerly regions, right?
In the southern regions of California.
I actually started writing a parody song for that based on a YouTube comment.
Oh, yeah?
They made a joke about... they made a joke about how Kids Bop was going to do a clean version of WAP.
I saw one where it was a middle school science teacher who did Wet Ass Planet.
I love it.
It's just about the Earth. Yeah.
There's been a lot of them. There's one that it was wings and pizza, and the other one, but mine was going to be milk and cookies.
Okay.
Santa. And it was just about kids needing to do your chores, right? Gotta brush your teeth 7 days a week. No one want to smell your breath every time you speak. Got to do your chores if you want milk and cookies.
Oh,
I don't know. I thought it was fucking clever.
Do it, man.
Anyway,
it's worth it.
Let's jump in. Today, we are discussing Ukraine again. It's in the news a lot.
Yeah.
Specifically, though, we're going to do a cursory examination about weapons transfers to the Ukraine, specifically because evidence is pointing to the fact that most of those weapons, maybe not most, but many of those weapons are going to far-right violent extremist groups. And ultimately, it's kind of starting to feel like a repeat of what we did in the 80s when we had a proxy war against, at the time, the Soviet Union and armed groups that would later become Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, et cetera, so forth. And essentially destabilized a region and put really kind of dangerous right-wing forces in charge of large arsenals.
Right.
So are we repeating history? I don't know.
And ultimately, maybe was that the goal to begin with?
Maybe that was the goal to begin with.
Going to get them resources.
So I think we got a bunch of stuff lined up. We're trying to show some more kind of document stuff rather than all video clips. Try and hit on some stuff and have a narrative, a coherent narrative that provides evidence to our argument, which our conclusion is weapons are being transferred without a lot of oversight, and there is reason to believe that much of them are making their way into the black market and onto violent extremist groups.
We have a history of not being able to audit our own shit very well.
No, and actually, that's where we're going to start. Actually, no, we're going to start with a clip from the Watson Institute, which a Brown University.
That is what you have said. It's the
Okay, if I put that
Watson.
in the notes, that's what it was.
Yeah.
It's kind of like an academic research organization nested within a university. And there's a webinar they did talking about the Ukraine crisis and the peace dividend and other kinds of topics. And so we have a brief clip just kind of showing the viewers here, like how big the disparity is between Russian arms and U.S. NATO arms, to kind of call into question whether we need to be sending all those weapons to the Ukraine if Russia does have enough weapons to be a formidable force or not. So let us roll that clip. And I will include in the show notes the speaker's name. I don't think I put that in my own notes.
All right. I can add it in once we get there.
Unless I did. I don't recall.
Didn't see
I don't think I did.
But
yeah, I'll add it in.
the bottom line here is that none of this should be terribly unexpected. Russia is a large country, but it's also a very weak country. We've known that for a long time. I guess this paper is simply a reminder of that fact. And look at the tremendous disparity in defense spending. The United States spends well over 10 times what Russia spends, which, if you think about it, is quite incredible and really is reflected in the war that we're seeing, where Russia has trouble doing what we would consider relatively simple military operations. This lays out the disparity even more, because when we factor NATO in, we see that if you take NATO aggregate spending, by the way, it doesn't include Japan, and Russia does not have a good relationship with Japan, so they have to plan against Japan too. But Russia spending versus NATO aggregate is a mere 6%. Okay, so to me, adding more to that, adding more to the Pentagon, adding more to this disparity is not going to help. It may make things worse. Indeed, I do think it's probably part of the problem. And when you see just how grave the disparity is, you can see that Russia, as was put in a New York Times article this morning, is sort of cornered and is more dangerous than ever, kind of like a cornered rat, I think, to use Putin's own phrasing.
Just look at those numbers. Because those numbers tell the story right there. Main battle tanks. Who gives a shit about battle tanks in modern warfare? Aircraft carriers. 11 times as many.
You have I have a background, obviously, in aviation warfare, and you have a background in naval warfare.
Correct.
What are you seeing here in these disparities?
I'm seeing aircraft carriers first and foremost. Like, aircraft carriers represent so much power, such long power. It's the ability to strike thousands of miles away. And we outnumber them by 10 aircraft carriers. They literally just have one token aircraft carrier, probably just to say they have one. And then if you look at scroll down to my favorite, of course, the submarines, where we have like twice as many as them, a little bit more actually. And then the non-nuclear submarines that they have are a threat, but they're more easily detectable since they have to surface for air in order to run the engines. And so,
and also they're super loud, right? Because they're just using diesel engines.
Yep, diesel
and then
engines.
they don't have the range either, because
they can run on battery, but battery won't get you as far. And so in terms of stealth and then just pure, how far we can make it inland power, it's very asymmetrical. The only thing that I see here that really worries me is the nuclear weapons. And again, that is what gives Russia the power to the weight, the gravitas to try and push their way onto the world field, is that nuclear arsenal.
Yeah, and I think as we discussed before, it's their shield, right? Like, hey, we may not have a really good offense capability, but we do have the capacity to respond if necessary against a threat to our territorial integrity. As the president of Russia said. Battle tanks, lands war, not mobile,
That's good against
logistically hard to
Ukraine.
move.
Yeah,
I think in Ukraine that's a little bit more valuable of a number
absolutely. Yeah.
since they're able to cross land to engage in that conflict. Amphibious warships, are those just landing craft? What is meant by that?
I am going to assume that is, given all the other
Categories?
categories that I see, because I don't see anything else that would cover. But yeah, it sounds like troop carriers that can land troops
Okay.
and deploy.
Right. And then for Corvette, is that just like a outdated technology?
It's an outdated technology. It is based around battleships instead of carriers, and so you
Mm.
needed different support vehicles, and they represented that. Frigates, you'll see that we have a lot of those. It's because they are attached to carrier battle groups, and they are the ones that have
Point
the eight.
defense, right?
It's point defense. It's to make sure if there's any incoming rockets that they can shoot them down.
Right. Those are the ones equipped with the C-rams, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the
Those
automatic
guns
like
that
guns.
fire fucking like is it thousands a minute or something like that? Thousands of rounds.
Per minute?
Yeah,
Yeah, probably thousands per minute.
yeah. It's fucking
Yeah.
insane.
I don't know. It's really not relevant to the conversation, but yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
They're actually quite scary. There was one next to my dormitory in Afghanistan.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, no, they're loud, and obviously if they're activated, like there's a rocket like or
Yeah.
mortar like flying at you. So it's pretty terrifying.
You're
But
you're
they're
thankful
pretty
for
effective
them,
too.
but yeah.
Yeah, and then the attack helicopters. I would say attack helicopters are probably one of the most useful pieces of military hardware, and we have more than double.
Yeah, it's a lot of mobility, but it's also a big moving target.
Right, but the countermeasure to that is fairly sophisticated and fairly expensive, like Stinger missiles and shit.
Right.
Like, I mean, these are man pads, right? Like, so man portable air defense weapons. Um, it's just another specialized weapon that you have to bring with you in the field to counter them.
Right.
But the
Right.
mobility is really the advantage that I was trying to point out. Because then you're not limited by terrain in the way you would be with a battle tank or whatever.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and you can
And
obviously move a hell of a lot faster than you can on foot or in APCs or Humvees or whatever, right?
there are specific anti-tank um, helicopters. So
Oh yeah. The attack helicopters are wild, and they generally have like larger caliber machine guns, and they serve both to engage personnel, but also equipment and armored units. Anyway, the point of that is to say we know that Russia has limited capacities to engage in to threaten the United States and really threaten anybody. They don't have a naval force that's sufficient enough to successfully blockade um, shipping lanes or whatever, right?
and not enough ports as well.
And not enough ports, which is the whole reason that they insisted on maintaining control over Crimea, or at least having, friendly relations with those who are in control of Crimea, right? When all this
Yeah,
started.
yeah. Their desire was to not be landlocked on their western border.
Right. It's their only warm water port, as far as I know. There might be another one in the Pacific, but I think that's a cold water port. And then all of their North Atlantic ports it's too costly and too dangerous to move naval vessels through like narrow passages full of fucking ice.
Right. Hey, the good news for them is global warming is going to solve that problem. They'll have warm water ports all over the place soon.
That's right. They'll be growing bananas in Alaska. Actually, I heard they're already grazing cattle in Alaska, and that's beyond the scope of this conversation.
Right.
But I want to look more into that and talk about that because that shit's fucking wild. Okay, so we've established that the United States and NATO in that last clip, he showed kind of how even NATO as an organization which just receives, that's who the U.S. is transferring weapons to. NATO, as it exists right now, their stockpiles are already much, much larger than Russian stockpiles.
Right. Double in some
So
cases.
what do is we send more weapons. So let's move into that. I think we're going to look at an article, right?
Yeah. It's over on your feed right now.
Yep. Okay, great. So I am going to share this tab. And the article is not there. So let's stop sharing that tab and start sharing this one instead. So basically that article, and it was printed in a bunch of different publications, including like various kind of military stars and stripes, not in Stars and Stripes that I saw, but those types of military publications that are more kind of popular press that only cover defense issues or war issues. And basically that article was talking about how the Pentagon failed its 5th audit. And this is an audit of inventory, not, I don't think specifically of spending, but an audit of inventory. And it's a super costly process. I forget the figure, but it costs like tens of millions of dollars to conduct an audit.
Yeah, and I've got it pulled up on my side right now, so everyone can see it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Oh, you have it up on your side.
Yeah.
Sure. The takeaway that I wanted from this article, and everything is in the show notes so that you can see it. Let me see if I can bring this out.
View those if you have any questions.
Can I blow it up? I can. Cool. So they had the 5th audit failure, meaning that this process is happening. We're spending tens of millions of dollars only for us to get, every handful of years, I think it is every 3 to 5 years or so, they do one of these audits. And we spend tens of millions of dollars as taxpayers on these audits, which to me, like, if we're going to spend tax money, I would like to be able to use it for investigations into fraud, waste, and abuse and other kinds of things like that. And ultimately they failed. And the reason this failure was important is because Pentagon comptroller or officials that are in that area of the Pentagon that manage inventories and logistics and all that stuff, they're like, we learned a pretty decent lesson here because we're not really sure what weapons we have. And the more weapons we know we have, the more we can send to Ukraine because they're surplus. So like, jump in here with me. Like, what's your take on the fact? Like, it almost seems intuitive, honestly, that like, of course we just have fucking warehouses full of weapons, but we don't even know what's there, right?
I mean, it's pretty bad on its face, obviously. You're like, this is basic, warehouse and stocking, 101. Like we teach teenagers how to do this shit at stores. And here we are as a country failing at it. And so it kind of makes me think it's a bit intentional. Mm-hmm. And yet, they are saying that if we had better tracking, we could probably send more weapons. And so you're like, well, maybe not.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to take away is this is the 5th time they failed, and their like attitude about it is like, oh, this is a teachable moment, I think is the quote.
It is.
And moreover, like the fact that we have weapons in warehouses that we don't even know exist, like despite the Defense Authorization Act continuing to give more and more money to the Pentagon to build weapon systems and to develop new weapon systems, when we have so many weapons, again, referring back to that chart where there's hard numbers, we know how many ships we have.
Right.
Because ships are pretty important and there's all sorts of support crews and they belong to some commander, right? He's responsible for training the crews and maintaining the vessel, etc., so forth. So we know how many of those we have. But shit that fits in a warehouse,
right?
Like small arms, this could be things like helmets and body armor, rockets. A lot of it is munitions, right? Like rockets and other types of things. We don't even know what we have. And in this audit, they determined we still don't know what we have.
Right.
But it's good that we looked into what we have, because now when Congress asks for weapons, we have a laundry list of things that are available. And in here in this article, he says the United States has not been in a position where we've only got a few days of some critical ammunition left, but we are now supporting a partner who is.
Right. Right there.
So that's basically a statement of assurance that's like, we got plenty to go around, right? In fact, we have so much that we don't even know where it all is.
Yeah.
And like, I was on Jesus, what's that base in El Paso? It's a large military installation. I forget what it was called. Fort Bliss? Yeah, Fort Bliss, I think it is. At any rate, like I transitioned through there and processed through there before going to Afghanistan. And like you're walking, like they have this like little kind of commercial district. It's actually kind of nice. They got like a cigar shop and a Buffalo Wild Wings and shit. So you can just kind of hang out and recreate or whatever, get some food and beer or whatever. And like right next to that is all this warehouse space, and in the middle of the road are these old rail lines that probably haven't been used since like Vietnam, probably. Or that era rather, right? Like the 70s or whatever. And there's all these warehouses, and I can only imagine, and they're all like locked off, and there's security cameras and stuff. But there's no one around. No one's actively using those warehouses. And so in my mind, I'm like, are these just like old buildings that they just haven't wanted to spend the money to knock down and redevelop this spot for something else, like either expanding the morale and welfare services, or for barracks or whatever else you might use, right?
Right.
Or is it just housing a bunch of shit that we don't even like? It's just a place to park it, right?
I mean, we have to produce every year, because if you don't produce, then the economy dies, and a bunch of Rust Belt areas would cease to exist. And so you got to stick it somewhere.
Right, and we're going to get to that at the tail end, because I think that's ultimately the driver of this is
Right.
that war is the best means of dealing with a system that's so good at producing that it produces too much, and that causes problems, right?
Yep.
So war is a good way to just like throw away
Consume resources. Yeah.
But we're not even throwing them away, or we haven't been, because they're all in warehouses and we don't even know where they fucking are. So anyway, we can move on to the next article. I just wanted to say, I just kind of wanted to draw into this that like, not only do we have a lot of more weapons, like capital weapons, like ships and helicopters and shit like that, but we don't even know where all of our, I guess you could say, personnel
material
weapons are.
Yeah.
Right. And they could just be in random ass warehouses next to the Buffalo Wild Wings at Fort Bliss, and we spend tens of millions of dollars to kind of be like, poke around in a dusty warehouse and be like, I wonder if there's any dangerous weapons here.
There's a guy at the Buffalo Wild Wings that dug a tunnel over there, and he's just shooting an AR-15.
Well, realistically, munitions like rockets and shit probably be in those dirt bunkers.
Right.
Yeah. I would fucking hope, but who knows, right? Because we don't know where they all are. So it's totally possible that it could have been one of those things where it's like, oh, we got to rearrange that munitions bunker there. So just park them here for a little bit. It'll only be for a few weeks. And then they fucking forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have so much that we can literally just forget it exists.
Right.
And more will come. Because you said, some congressmen in the Rust Belt's like, well, this factory employs, 600 people, and I need those jobs.
Right. And
so anyway,
let's pay them to do nothing. We got to pay them to do something.
Exactly. Let's move on to the next one.
All right.
Speaking of Pentagon's failing audits, I think I'm sharing the tab, correct?
Pressure builds to step up weapons tracking. Yeah.
Yes. So this is from the Washington Post. It's another story that's been around. Washington Post, of course. I almost want to do a study on like headlines and phrasing, because it's the same story. If you read the headline in Fox News versus the Washington Post versus Reuters, it's all about the same thing, but the way they present it is so glaringly different. This is pressure builds to step up tracking weapons for Ukraine or whatever. And the Fox News was like, Republicans holding Democrats accountable for their, waste or missing millions of dollars of money or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Or Democrats stand in the way of giving weapons to Ukraine, something along those lines.
Cool. Sorry, I had zoomed in on that other one and couldn't move it, but now I can. Oh, cool. Look at that. Stinger missiles. We were just talking about those.
Yo.
So the point of this is that it's almost become part of political theater. That Republicans are like, oh yeah, we're going to audit you. And their point, and kind of what I drew out of there, was that they're not against sending weapons. They just don't think that the value of it is reflected in the cost, if that is not absolutely confusing. Instead of 40 million, they say, oh, he's just trying to throw money at this problem, and we really only need to send 20 million or whatever it is.
Right.
Which I find to be revealing in the way that they're kind of presenting themselves as like these bastions of transparency and accountability.
And budget hawks, as they always are when they're not in control. The moment they're in control, fuck the budget. But when they're not in control, budget hawks.
Absolutely. And one of the things in this article that I wanted to point out is that most in Washington are in agreement that the push for oversight is a good thing. Of course they are.
Right.
But experts caution there are credible limitations to ensuring airtight account of all weapons given to Ukraine that are likely to leave Biden's harshest critics unsatisfied. What that tells me, limitations to ensuring airtight account of all weapons given to the Ukraine, is that not only are we uncertain exactly what we're giving to them, we're uncertain of how, if they're actually getting into the hands of frontline fighters.
And from that previous article, if we even have them to give to them, or if it's all just on paper, like weapons transferred, it goes from one column in a spreadsheet into another column. And is anything actually being moved over? Are we giving the full amount? Things of that nature. Yeah.
Right. And so here's their excuse. There are shortcomings of end use monitoring in the best circumstances. And of course, Ukraine isn't the best of circumstances. So basically what they're saying is that like, we never really know where it goes.
Yeah.
And we're not certain. We can't be 100% certain that Congress says we want to deliver weapons to this fighting force, blah, blah, blah. We can't guarantee 100% that they move from the United States into the proper hands that Congress has authorized the weapons for.
Well, right. We're not handing them, directly over to, Zelensky. We're basically laundering them through NATO. And so anywhere along the way, they can be misdirected or straight out stolen. We would have no accountability. Someone would have like a signed sheet of paper that said, oh yeah, it was delivered there. But what evidence do we have?
Right. And ultimately, this is kind of being like, this statement here is like, there's not really an effective way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So for the purposes of our narrative today, Russia is severely underarmed compared to NATO.
Right.
We don't know where all our weapons are. And now we are sending those weapons to Ukraine, but we can't really guarantee where they're going.
Right.
And I also just kind of wanted to point out that I'm going to stop sharing this if you want to go back to just us.
Yeah, sure.
I probably screwed that up somehow. But kind of the point I was getting at is that that I wanted to make a tangential point to is how this is kind of almost used as political theater, right? Where it's like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's I don't really know much about her other than that she's like kind of like a rabid, like right winger, like fake right wing populist, kind of uses all the culture wars rhetoric and stuff.
Yeah.
And she's becoming the face of government accountability, right? And of course, it's it's like a gotcha, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's putting pressure. I do want to point out too that remember when Trump got impeached, it wasn't for his violations of the emoluments clause and all the backdoor business dealings he was doing while in office, and all the other kind of corruption that was involved, because Congress would never hold him accountable for corruption because they're all fucking corrupt too, right?
He's got shit on them too.
But what they did impeach him for was not sending weapons, right? Or rather, delaying the sending of weapons into the Ukrainian civil war. Because remember, it was a civil war until Russia involved itself to ensure that the areas of Russian speakers and industrial areas and port cities that are geostrategically important to Russia remained outside of the hands of Western puppet regimes, right? And so we have this whole system where it's just two houses, two parties in Congress lobbing accusations at each other, but largely agreeing with sending weapons. But you have the most rabid right-wing figures presenting themselves as the voice of reason.
Right. Now.
Right. Because of course, when they were after 9/11, and this all happened in Iraq too, right? Is it a coincidence that we had fucking ISIS after like the US flooded this fucking region with weapons?
Right.
And money, like unmarked fucking cash?
I think it was a direct. I was going to say it's really a direct cause and effect. You flood an area with weapons, you don't have full accountability for where they end up, and even if you do, they can get captured and taken. So you just kind of arm everyone ultimately, and really hope for the best.
Elements.
Huh?
I would say you're arming primarily the worst elements.
Oh yeah.
I don't think the little shopkeeper who's got 3 or 4 kids and a wife at home is all that eager to fucking pick up arms. But what we do is we destroy the functioning economy as it exists, while packing it full of small arms and other munitions and stuff. And we just create this environment where like people are jobless because there's no infrastructure to support an economy because we bombed it all. Right. And then everybody has access to weapons.
We're basically exporting America.
We're creating warlordism.
Yeah.
A big kind of thread throughout the whole project of this podcast is to talk about the collapse of industrial civilization, and also to talk about that process through history and how dark ages throughout human history have been characterized by warlordism. Right.
Oh, yeah.
And how we're just kind of like in our attempt, as it happens in history, empires overextend themselves trying to maintain control. And as Nemec's manifesto in the Star Wars TV series Andor pointed, like, power is fragile because like you have to keep investing in control. So more and more of your resources are expended trying to control something that like naturally can't be controlled. So you have the United States trying to project its imperial hegemony, its economic hegemony across the globe. And in the process, basically accelerating these regions into dark ages.
Well, I mean, you can see it too, and you compare and contrast the images of, I think it was Afghanistan in the 70s to now, and to start contrasting, you had women in high heels, showing off leg and all that stuff, and now they're in hijabs and all that, and it was just, we destabilized it. The worst elements of like that control, like you're saying, is so very unstable, but they had it. And then we just knocked its legs out, and the worst elements stepped up and seized control. And we're
Yep.
doing that everywhere. We're doing that in Ukraine right now.
Right
We're,
now.
like, we're having other people do it for us, but we're doing it, you know. And so
Absolutely.
it's just exporting garbage, basically, because we can't stop spending money on arms.
Yeah. I mean, it's largely part of it, but I think it's also kind of like this is the consequence of trying to maintain control over a system that is always going to reject your presence.
Well, yeah.
Right.
So every time we find some place that has resources that we need, we can't just deal with them civilly. We can't pay them a fair price for that. Capitalism won't allow it. We have to pay the bare minimum price, and it's ultimately cheaper to send in a bunch of weapons, destabilize the region, and grab what we want than it is to bargain with people, pay them a fair price, uplift them while uplifting ourselves at the same time. It's just not going to happen because it doesn't fit in with the landscape.
I think you're 100% correct. Let's move on to the next clip so we can continue this conversation.
Yeah.
And this is a clip. This is God damn it, I forget his name. He's a reporter who's publishing at the Gray Zone, which we've featured some of those folks before. Fucking amazing publication. Link in the description. This is an interview on Primo Radical, which is also a really cool interview centered YouTube channel. And he does a lot of really great interviews. Some of his stuff is kind of iffy. His coverage of the Green Party was definitely like absolutely garbage, but this is a fantastic interview that fits right into what we're talking about today.
And so you do want to skip over the CRS and the gunpolicy.org?
Oh, no, I don't. Thank you. I'm just looking at that and my mind went there. So next on the docket, we have, just to show some primary source material here.
Yeah, back to your feed.
I think I closed the tab. That was the problem, dude.
Oh, no. Yeah, don't hit stop sharing. Just let me know to go back, and then you can switch to a different tab. Let me know when you get
Yeah, no problem. I'm going to load up real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Browser feed, share screen room. We're doing Microsoft Edge tab.
We're learning. We're learning this stuff as we go, everyone.
Yeah, and I think we're fairly smooth compared to some people, except that
I've definitely seen worse.
Mute that because I had to open a new tab.
Oh yeah.
Is my video out of focus?
No, looks pretty good. Let me go back to the main screen.
It's just
looks good.
Little lag here on the processor, which is
weird. Yeah, your audio ticked for a second, but I think you're good.
Cool. So this is the Congressional Research Service, which is basically like a organization within the United States government that's responsible for doing all the like academic bullshit. Congressional Research Service produces some of the finest documents that summarize legislation and various decision-making processes. And anytime like a congressional committee wants to know something, the Congressional Research, as I understand, the Congressional Research Service is the organization that gets tasked with producing the report for the committee.
Okay. Since
1914. So they're an integral part into informing Congress. And surprisingly, I'm not sure if there's kind of an internal control, but it doesn't seem to be biased beyond the kind of the bias that's introduced by everybody sharing the worldview that like they work for the U.S. government. So right. So it's not particularly critical of the United States, but it is very much fact-based analysis.
Okay.
And really all they do is go out to the various organizations and get information from them and summarize it. In most cases, I think CRS does do some other stuff with kind of more exploratory, like what has been done in states that relates to this particular issue and what kind of models already exist in other countries that we might look at as we make decisions. So they do all sorts of great stuff. Anyway, the screen's up, right?
It is, yeah.
Okay, great. I just mostly wanted to point this out because a lot of folks touching on U.S. proxy war in the Ukraine, et cetera, so forth, and calling into question how much money we're sending. They don't really get into the primary sources. I do want to say this was recently updated.
Very recent.
When I started putting the show together earlier this week, it was only through like the third week of November, I want to say, before Thanksgiving. So this is after the Thanksgiving holiday. They came back and updated it to include authorization on November 23rd.
Nice.
And I just kind of wanted to point out, we were talking about this Pentagon audit, how they're trying to find weapons in warehouses, places they don't know where they are, so that they can send them, because ultimately that's what our programs are.
Mhm.
As of right now, as I understand it, we are not manufacturing weapons to send to Ukraine. We're sending old weapons that have already been in a warehouse for a while, probably most of them created during the lead up in the surge in Iraq, where we were producing weapons hand over fist, and there was pretty much
that's diabolical, though, as it has the knock-on effect of basically lowering our strategic reserves, and so now we need to build new shit.
Well, right, and that's what that last article was kind of getting at. Not the last one, the one before that, where the comptroller of the Pentagon was basically like, it's not like we're in a bad spot and we're running out of
Yeah.
So anyway, I just kind of don't need to really dwell on this so much, except that this, when you hear that the value of weapons sent, this is the authorizations just since the U.S. Only after Russia invaded the Ukraine. This does not include weapons transfers that took place earlier. And we've kind of been involved there since the CIA helped support the coup against the government and install their puppet regime. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to point this out. You can go Congressional Research Service, do all this, and find actual concrete examples or concrete numbers and figures for what it is. And you can get a little bit deeper into the woods here. So, for example, here where they a laundry listed out 38 high mobility artillery rocket systems and ammo, surface to air missiles, tanks, right? Stinger anti-aircraft, Javelin anti-aircraft. Look at that. 38,000 other anti-armor systems.
For the tanks that Russia has an abundance of.
Right. Howitzers, which is just artillery, right?
Yeah, long distance artillery.
And howitzer, that's a standalone artillery, right? That's not on a tank, or is it? I don't
know. I've always heard it. I always kind of got the feeling it was related to tanks. Hey, if anybody knows, leave it in the comments.
Yeah, leave it in the comments, please. Tactical unmanned aerial systems.
Sending drones.
Weapon capable drones.
Yeah.
To a government that unseated the previous government by use of Nazi militias. Armored personnel carriers, of course, grenade launchers and small arms.
Yeah.
Comms, radar, and intelligence equipment. They don't even care to
provide
a list of those, because then it's 65,000 two-way encrypted radios or
we
whatever.
Can't afford.
Right?
Yeah, they're like, oh yeah, we can't afford to get too granular. This would be like a 500-page document instead of a 3-page document. Anti-radiation missiles. What the fuck is a high-speed anti-radiation missile?
Which one are you looking at?
It starts with 1500 tube launched optically tracked, and if you look, it says HARMS, high-speed anti-radiation missiles. And now I'm Googling, and I'm on a list.
On my list here, you're seeing high radiation?
Anti-radiation.
Oh, anti-radiation missiles. Yeah.
What the hell is that?
Understand what the hell that is. You could look it up. I mean, how could you be anti-radiation?
Right? Right. Let's see. It says a tactical air-to-surface anti-radiation missile designed to home in on electronic transmissions coming from surface-to-air radar systems. Oh my God. Originally developed by Texas Instruments. So they're not just making the fucking calculators. Uh,
Right.
it's been taken over since then by Raytheon. Of course, of course. Oh, when it purchased the defense of production business of Texas. So maybe they are just calculators now. Description. It can detect, attack, and destroy a radar antenna or transmitter. Okay, that's what it is. So it's seeking out the radiation that is being used for tracking and basically blinding them. Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay. So it's basically like chaff or
But more permanent because it blows it the fuck up.
oh, I see. So it
Yeah.
it it's a just a weapon specifically to identify those systems and destroy them.
Yep.
Okay. I did lastly want to point out, sorry, were you saying something?
No, no. Sorry, it's just sitting there.
I did also want to just point out here this act here passed by Congress that I had never heard of, Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act. Bypasses bureaucratic barriers for lending and leasing defense articles to Ukraine and neighboring countries.
Of course it does. Why wouldn't we want to, have bureaucratic barriers in place that make us think about things for more than 13 seconds?
Right. And exactly. And so we now have this picture of, okay, cool. We looked at all the toys or whatever that are getting sent over. But like realistically, part of the reason this just feeds on what we discussed from the previous article, that we don't know where it's going. And oh, that's normal. It's really hard to keep track, follow war, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but Congress also passed a law to circumvent some of the measures that might help us understand where this shit is going.
Right. Wouldn't want that.
Or, for example, oh, hey, like these are kind of questionable in terms of like international arms control laws, right? But now there's not going to be any question. There's no kind of check and balance, so to speak, on is this a good idea to give to a regime that's like
unstable,
fucking Nazis?
Yeah. Well,
I don't know.
And neighboring countries. Like, please define. There are a lot of neighboring countries. Not all of them are aligned with our interests.
They probably mean like Poland, Romania.
Yeah.
We've had air bases in Romania. I forget when Romania came into NATO, but there's been a base there for a long time. I actually passed through there on my way to Afghanistan. It was actually pretty rad. Like, I mean, it's not rad to have an empire or whatever, but like the air base was straight up like in the countryside or whatever. Like, I didn't really get a good look at exactly where it was, but I do remember when we were taxiing, probably like a fucking stone's throw from the tip of the wing was a barbed wire fence, and on the other side of that was just a fucking sheep herder, dude. There's like a dude out in the field, like some kind of like peasant or small agricultural producer, herding a sheep in a field, like right next to the runway. It was fucking wild.
Getting pissed off, scaring my sheep.
Okay, so now we know Congress has reduced the bureaucratic oversight.
Fantastic.
And we know that we have warehouses full of weapons. We don't know where they are. And we know that it's pretty common for weapons to get transferred and to not have any kind of, what do you call that? Chain of command or chain of custody.
Yeah, chain of custody.
Okay. No chain of custody to ensure they're getting to the right people. Now let us look at Ukraine as far as its relationship to the global arms industry.
One thing before we go, if you could hold down the control button and roll the mouse wheel away from you, that should... Oh, other way. There we go. There we go.
Thanks.
Just wanted to zoom in.
Talking about zooming in.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't care about small arms. We don't care about all that stuff. Arms exports. Yeah, here we go. Reports to the Register of Conventional Arms record governmental transfers of small arms, including a number of revolvers, pistols, rifles, carbines, submachine guns, blah, blah, blah. Is known to have exported 140,000 firearms per year. It says that most of them are going to, Western kind of countries. Georgia's a NATO country. I don't think the Czech Republic is NATO, but I could be mistaken. But they are a Western company. But then you have other documented importers, including Uganda, Azerbaijan, where they have a territorial dispute and a war ongoing, Sudan, Armenia, which is also a party to the conflict in the Caucasus, Chad, not exactly known as like, a stable democracy, right? Pakistan, Kenya, right?
Yeah.
And then arms brokering. So Ukraine is a place where a lot of weapons pass through. Legally. That's what these are legally, right?
Right.
And I did want to point out this one too. Remember when Somali pirates were all the rage in the news?
Yes, I do.
Well, it turns out that
I am the captain now.
That the Somali pirates were actually taking, capturing ships that were transferring weapons into, again, Kenya. I wouldn't put on the top of unstable republics or countries in Africa, but we know that region has been prone to violence for a long time. The South Sudan carve out was fairly recently. There's kind of been ongoing, like, not full-blown civil wars, I wouldn't characterize them as, but certainly kind of like more contained acts of violence, and also like a lot of extremist groups. So we have those weapons going from Ukraine into these countries that at the time in 2008, I want to say there were active conflicts on the ground. So they're facilitating armed conflict in other areas of the world. It's just not contained in the Ukraine, as we'd like to think. Arms brokering, smuggling, and trafficking. Here's the big one. Military stocks worth $32 billion went missing and were sold abroad. C, diversion of state stocks. Right? So what happened is, after the Iron Curtain fell, Ukraine had a bunch of like Soviet era weapons, but also has been a pass-through country for Western arms going into places that they wouldn't normally be able to go to due to kind of arms control agreements, or individual state governments being like, I don't think we should send a bunch of weapons into these conflict-prone regions, right? So they just use Ukraine as a pass-through. And it's significant. I encourage everybody to read this article, gunpolicy.org, which I believe, let me see if I can scroll down here. Lots of footnotes. It is Sydney School of Public Health, University of Sydney. And gunpolicy.org is kind of like a, as I understand, is again, it's kind of like a coordination organization for various international scholars that research this issue. Actually, you can see that in the about thing. Diversion of state stocks. Ukraine's huge, often unguarded weapon armories and ammunition magazines have been easy targets for theft. Military stocks valued about $90 billion US. And by another estimate, had been stolen and mainly sold abroad. Right? So
I mean, they're obviously not buying them, or they wouldn't need, so they're obviously not buying them, or they wouldn't need our weapons.
Right. And so the way this fits into our broader narrative here is that, like, not only are we sending weapons into a country without like clear chain of custody to ensure that that's where they're going. But we know, and the international community knows, that Ukraine is a pass-through for arms trafficking.
They have a history of losing a lot of shit.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not even to mention some of the other stuff. I think one of our video clips will go into it. Actually, I think the Primo Radical does, if I recall correctly.
He is next.
So we can go ahead and move on to that, but I highly encourage anybody that wants to understand this issue, read a little bit more about the Ukraine's role in the global arms trade and how they're a pass-through from Western arms manufacturers to conflict-prone regions, how they don't have much control. The state doesn't have like strong controls over their weapon stockpile, so they can just be stolen,
Right.
and find their way into various like far-right militia groups, etc., so forth. But it's just, this is painting a really, I think, a pretty clear picture that like sending unaccounted for arms into this place is a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that was the last of the things that I was going to share, so I'm going to stop sharing. Check it out. That's a cool article. And then we're back to Primo Radical, I think, and this journalist from the Gray Zone. I forget his name, man. I need to like have a note card with all my, because I put my notes in digital form and then they're like on a different device or whatever.
You got to get a second browser going on your computer so you can have a podcast tracker loaded up on a separate browser, and then you can do notes there. Because if you right click on a cell and do note, this is boring for everyone, but I'm going to cover it anyway. If you right click on a cell, you can insert notes, and then if you hover over that cell, they pop up, and so you can put the names of the people. You can put any like ideas that you had. If you look back at our notes, none of you can do that, but he can. You'll see a lot of little notes that I put in.
Cool. Yeah, and I was trying to kind of write the narrative out of notes, but yeah, I'll keep that in mind because we should. And this will be in the show description.
Yeah.
Hopefully with his name. But
I'll
I do
make
know
sure
he
it's
writes
there.
at the Gray Zone, and this is on Primo Radical. And let's listen to what he has to say. The title of this video is "Are NATO Weapons for Ukraine Reaching the Black Market?" I think what we just read, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But he's a journalist that studies this or is reporting on this, and so has some pretty specific anecdotes that I think really kind of hammer the point I was trying to make with an article home. Let's do it.
The international arms black market is implausibly fluid. Like, there was a report a few years back that there was a teenage drug gang in the north of England that had the kind of elite machine guns that were used by British special forces in Afghanistan. Like how did they end up there? And so it's I think one of the major concerns is, you want to talk about blowback. Like, effectively, it does seem fairly inevitable now that Russia is going to, emerge victorious. It's probably going to be a very long, grinding war, but it seems fairly inevitable. And, in that context, you're going to have a lot of very, pissed off, embittered former fighters, among them many neo-Nazis, of course, who have ready access to vast amounts of weaponry. And there's already my Grey Zone colleague Alex Rubinstein has reported on another story that has gotten zero mainstream traction of a neo-Nazi cell in Italy, comprised of people who fought in Ukraine, who were planning terrorist attacks. So that's already before the war was even over. This is a reality and a major threat.
So yeah,
you give your comments because, like,
well, I think the answer is becoming more and more clear that yeah, absolutely, we're just basically getting weaponry over by the, I think it's tens of billions now. It's got to be, adding up all those numbers with no accountability, and it's probably just being used to enrich certain individuals who are able to take them and sell them on the black market. So great. I'm glad my tax dollars are being used to enrich people in other countries.
Yeah, and what did you take about his first statement about like all these like basically pissed off and unemployed people? Because there's that
Oh,
dynamic
right.
too that's not really like largely explored about that blowback he referred to it as. But we discussed or referred to ISIS or Daesh earlier, and that's kind of the same thing, right? You have a country with no economic prospects. You have a lot of young men with no future and a whole lot of guns.
I
And
mean,
it just sets up a scenario where there's going to be inevitably violent conflict.
we've seen what that does in our own country. You get a bunch of pissed off, unemployed or underemployed men with a shit ton of weapons. And what happens? Terrorist attacks.
Young men,
Yeah.
terrorist attacks,
In your
mass
own
shootings.
soil. Yeah, mass shootings. Call them what you want. It's the same thing. But
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, and it's happening there. It's happening here. It doesn't really matter where you are. If you get disillusioned people, that are in our instance, told that life is pretty much going to be handed to them, and then they don't get that. They're confused. They look for someone else to blame, and they lash out.
Yeah, and had you heard that? I mean, I guess he did kind of like set it up as like, hey, it's not getting any mainstream traction,
Right.
but like they straight up tracked, and that's the other thing, right? This conflict is being used to train people to
Oh yeah.
fight.
Yeah.
And now the similar thing happened in Kurdish territories and the independence project there in northern Syria in Rojava, right? But they changed the name because Rojava was a Kurdish term, and they were like, well, no, we're kind of like a pluralistic kind of movement, political movement, and so let's call it something really boring, but not culturally or linguistically specific so that everybody feels included. I forget what they're calling it now, but basically there were a lot of uh, Western fighters, Americans, but also British fighters, Irish fighters, I think, that all kind of went there to fight ISIS as part of their defense forces. And you see this through history too. You had like the French Foreign Legion, like there were already Canadian and American soldiers fighting in the trenches in World War I before the US declared war, right?
Oh yeah.
And then
Anytime
you
something like
have
this happens.
all sorts of kind of, I forget the names of the organizations, but you had all sorts of American fighters like World War I veterans that were then going to join the Spanish anarchists, right, a decade later or whatever. And so you kind of have this where you get training by going and helping another people fight in their conflict.
Mhm.
And so it's unclear from what he said, and I haven't read anything about it, so I don't want to speculate too much, but it sounds like potentially Italian neo-Nazis or Italian fascist groups volunteered as foreign legionaries to go to the Ukraine to fight on behalf of the U.S. Western puppet regime in that civil war, right? Because this has been ongoing since at least 2014, right? So there's been lots of years for them to go and get some practice, and then they're coming back and they're part of the arms, like illicit arms trade or black market arms trade. And what are they doing? The Italian government or whatever, their investigative, their FBI equivalent, or whoever else, local police potentially even, uncovered this fucking terrorist plot by these fucking neo-Nazis that received their training in arms from the Ukraine.
And
Nazis.
It really is just a matter of like free training. You go help some people out. You get training as a mercenary. You get training in tactics, communications, all that stuff. It costs you nothing but the risk to your life. But you're going to do that anyway. You're that sort of person.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. So here so far we've kind of, I think by now people watching this, it should be abundantly clear that the title is not intended to be provocative, but actually a statement of fact.
Yes.
Like the U.S. through, although there's many pass-throughs and it's obscured by, political theater in Washington, et cetera, so forth. But ultimately, we're sending weapons. We're not even really sure what we're sending, and we have no control over where they're going. And we're sending them into a country that is known to be a pass-through state and or black market arms, center of gravity for black market arms trades globally. Yeah. And we're already seeing some of those weapons wind up in the hands of
Italian
gangs and neo-Nazis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it basically, to put it in computer terms, it sounds like a VPN, an onion router for weaponry. You put it through enough hands,
well done,
and
nerd.
You feel clean. You're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I just gave it to
I definitely did not download season 6 of Rick and Morty.
No, not at all. My hands are clean.
No,
This guy.
Somebody in Ohio did, though. Shame on them.
Exactly.
I don't know. Do you VPN other countries? You pretty much have to VPN in the US, right? To get access to a lot of US stuff.
Yeah. Anytime you want to do anything, even, I mean, a lot of times it's just good for your own security. Like if you're looking up things like harm missiles, probably should have turned on the VPN for a second, but yeah, it's just a good idea to keep yourself a little bit anonymous. And then, yeah, if you want to get like, oh, I want to watch something on Netflix, but I can't because it's not available. Let me just pretend like I'm in the UK. Oh, look, it's available. Hey.
Awesome. I think we're on our second to last. Penultimate clip. This is the Real News Network, which I'm very grateful to them for being a landing pad for Chris Hedges. We discussed months ago on this podcast,
right,
when the U.S. successfully tanked RT as Russian propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
That he lost his show and he kind of didn't have a home for a little while, but he was quick to land because he needs no introduction.
He's incredibly, yeah, exactly.
He's incredible. And his guest, in this clip, they're talking about the truth in Ukraine. And this is with Medea Benjamin, who is also a fairly well-known figure on the left. She is a co-founder of Code Pink, which is one of the more... God, I hate...
You want to use the word?
I don't want to call her a militant. Were you thinking I was going to call her a shit lib?
No,
because she's pretty fucking radical. Yeah, but like, I don't want to call them militant because like they are being disruptive in a way that a lot of other like kind of Democratic Party front groups will not be militant. In fact, I don't even think the Democratic Party has an anti-war front group. They just fucking silence all anti-war voices.
Yeah.
Unlike they have a climate change front group and a gun control front group, et cetera, so forth.
Because you can make money off of that.
I think Nick from a Revolutionary Blackout Network made a joke about kind of the arms stuff in Ukraine. He's like, what is it with fucking Democrats? They like out of one side of their mouth, they're like, oh, we care about gun violence, blah, 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 blah. While they're also authorizing massive amounts of weapons to be sent to neo-Nazis.
Yeah. And not doing anything at home either.
Cognitive dissonance, right? Yeah, and they're not doing anything. So they're not a front group. Medea Benjamin and Code Pink are as militant as it comes through nonviolent tactics. That's why I said I'm hesitant to call them militant.
Yeah, because Salvation Army, that's militant. This is not militant.
Anybody that adheres to kind of dogmatic ideas of nonviolence, I think, is not really particularly militant.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not saying you have to go like assassinate people. Obviously, I'm not condoning violence at all. But I mean, like, I'm not going to advocate property destruction either. But let's just say that nonviolent tactics are limited, and Code Pink is a nonviolent organization. But Medea Benjamin herself is a firebrand, and she's a fantastic public speaker, and she's a great face for the organization in the sense that she's so articulate and can kind of stay on message in a way that I clearly can't as we go into our second hour of us fucking rambling.
We do tend
to. What were you saying?
I said we do tend to, yes.
But that's okay. We're here for this. And hopefully we can kind of get into a place where we can clip it up and then people can digest smaller chunks.
Yes, very true.
But at any rate, this is Medea Benjamin talking about the Ukraine war with Chris Hedges on his show on the Real News Network. Let's go.
And that's why there were years ago, there were elements in the US government like Rokana who tried to stop US weapons from getting into the hands of the Azov battalion because of their human rights abuses, because of their Nazi ties. And yet, after the invasion of Russia, that has all been swept away and the weapons are just pouring in. And we have no idea who is getting those weapons. We have no idea how much this is empowering not only the neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, but similar right-wing fascists who have come in to join in the fight from many places around the world. And just like we see the pouring in of US weapons in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, what it led to, the creation of groups like ISIS, I fear that in the future, and let's hope we don't go towards nuclear war, but in the future, we will see the tremendous empowerment of these groups with so many of the weapons that the US has sent in.
Realistically, I totally forgot that that's the clip that I had set aside. We could have just played that and like cut like 45 minutes of our talking.
Gosh. Oh.
But I mean, nothing new was said there, right? Like,
No.
We don't know. And we brought up ISIS. I forgot she even brought up ISIS in this clip because it's just so transparent, right? Like, it's so easy to see the sequence of events. And we're so, like, people are so stupid. But it's not that they're stupid. It's that they're choosing to ignore it, right?
Yeah, willfully.
When you go into Sonoma County and you see nothing but fucking blue and yellow, like people flying Ukrainian flags.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I've seen a downtick of it around here.
What's that?
I've seen a downtick of that around here. Like for the first few months, people were very excited, and then it just kind of faded into the background noise of constant warfare that is American foreign policy, and people stopped caring.
Yeah, and it just shows how successful the propaganda was in that being like, it was unprovoked because we're not going to tell you all of the shit that's happened over the last several decades that led precisely to this moment.
Yeah, that's up to you to figure out on your own, or with the help of With Thunderous Applause podcast. And so most people aren't going to learn about it,
Oh, right. Wow. So we get to this point. Now we know we got too many weapons and they're going to neo-Nazis and other...
Anyone else who can afford them.
What's that?
Anyone else who can afford them.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And it's all because the U.S. has stockpiles of arms, so many so that they can't even tell you where they all are.
Or if we even still have them. I mean,
so why do we have warehouses full of weapons to where we feel compelled to now hand them to neo-Nazis?
Right. We should be handing them to the police. Oh, wait. No, they are neo-Nazis. Never mind.
Yeah, they already do.
Yeah.
And that's a subject for another day. I mean, it's just fucking outrageous. But why? Why are we building weapons? Richard Wolff and Mrs. David Harvey? Yeah?
Yes.
David Harvey is a social philosopher, economist. I have a book on my shelf from him. But he's a fairly, well-respected scholar. Richard Wolff, I think we featured before.
Yes.
He's an economist. And they're going to talk a little bit about war as a necessary component of a capitalist economy. Let's go.
But one of the theoretical points that I work with a lot is this idea of overaccumulation and the problems of the surplus and the absorption of the surplus over time. And what Marx does at a certain point is to start to kind of say, well, the surplus, which is used to generate more surplus, is problematic. And so there have to be some sinks, if you like, in which you can get rid of surplus in various ways. And there's a wonderful point in the Grunreis where he says, well, actually, if you really want to get rid of overaccumulated capital, then going to war is a good way to do it. He said, because going to war is just like, chucking surplus into the ocean. And so actually wartime activities, and this is again something I want to emphasize to people, when you see this headline that says the United States is giving $40 billion to Ukraine, actually what it's doing is giving $40 billion to the defense industry in the United States to build the stuff to send to Ukraine. So there's a wonderful kind of way in which the surplus is being disposed of, but being disposed of in such a way that it increasingly centralizes capital in these large industrial corporations which are producing armaments and high-tech kinds of things, so that this kind of overaccumulation idea is terribly important, and it leads into one of the phrases I use is this idea of a spatial fix, that when you get a country and you've absorbed saturated it, if you like, with capitalist development, you start to go abroad, and so you start to see the export of capital abroad and all that kind of thing. So how to dispose of the surplus. Do you do it by geographical expansion, which gets you into imperialist politics at a certain point? Or do you do it wastefully by going to war and, in effect, chucking the surplus into the ocean? So all of these things are going on at the same time as we start to see this global economy, which is kind of teetering around in the ways you say, lurching towards some sort of crisis, which is likely to be a crisis either on the supply side, which would be food deprivation and all of the things which are coming out of the current situation, or whether it's about sort of overaccumulation and all of the problems of overaccumulation that come out. I mean, through this expansion, by the way, we get this also connection to the ecological problems and the degradation of the environment and climate change and all the rest of it. So that the theory of overaccumulation, to me, is terribly important. It's part of that aspect of Marx's theory, which I think plays a very crucial role in this geopolitics and geopolitical struggles.
Yeah, so
that might have played a little long, I think.
It did. I didn't have an outro.
That's my bad, man.
That's all right. It just made me think, like, going to war is even better than throwing it in the ocean, because then you can get your returns on what you would have thrown in the ocean, so you can get more, resources, so you can make more surplus. Yeah.
Right. If you threw it in the ocean, then you couldn't lend it to someone at interest.
Right. And then also, war is slightly less popular than it is, or at least overt war is. And so all this extra surplus, I mean, yeah, we find ways to get rid of it, but there's still more. And so people have basically had to find new ways of getting surplus to work for them. And so you get things like the current housing crisis, where people have, run out of places to park their money. We've exported as much as we can to other countries. Everyone's got an iPhone. Everyone's got their widgets. And now we have to just buy up literally everything that there is that would normally be used for housing and food and whatnot, and privatize it all. So.
You're absolutely right. Privatization is absolutely a part of this process, as Harvey is explaining here. And it's just like, so one thing he didn't get correct was where he says, oh, it justifies arms manufacturers making this so that we could send it there. That's, as we showed earlier, not exactly accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, arms manufacturers will refill our coffers, but ultimately it's existing supplies that are being authorized to be sent. As far as I know, we're not, our arms manufacturing isn't like, there's not an order to increase production.
I mean,
their stocks are doing phenomenal, and we didn't even fucking touch on that.
No, I mean, I fall back on my statement that, when you use up the old shit, you have to refill with new shit. And so they are benefiting. Meaning it just makes sense that if you draw down your water table, your weapon table, you got to refill your weapon table back up, with newer shit. And so there is a call to manufacture. It's not.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's absolute bullshit. I'm just saying that there's a few more steps
Right.
involved. It's not like, oh, weapons manufacturers make them, we're sending them over.
Yeah, we're
And
using
that's
up the
how,
old
right?
shit. We're giving them the last year's model.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if we're in such a fucking remarkable time. It's all falling apart more quickly than I thought. Really.
Yeah.
I was watching a different Richard Wolff thing. He was talking about automobile manufacturing. I had no fucking idea
Oh.
that, like, because I don't fucking buy cars, right? Like, I'm not.
Right.
I know that used car prices went up significantly.
Yeah, my wife's car
But
doubled
new
in
car prices
value.
apparently did too, and that's driven used prices up.
It has, yeah. But basically, when we first had the chip shortages due to COVID, it was both, supply and demand, but also using that as an excuse to drive up the prices. Because car manufacturers have always wanted to have, the bare minimum for a car to be $30,000, $35,000, but they had to provide the $15,000 cars, the $20,000 cars. Those are a thing of the past now. You cannot find a new car for, I think, under 25,000.
They stopped making the Yaris.
They stopped manufacturing all the lower end cars because they weren't worth it. They didn't want to use what few chips they had to make a car that wouldn't turn them a massive profit. And so people had to turn to the used car market. Now my wife's Yaris that was worth like $3,000 is worth $6,000. It's outrageous for anyone who needs to travel, aka every American ever, except
Right, because
in
we
New York
built
City.
our entire human habitat to require the automobile.
Yeah,
Can't even go get fucking gallon of milk without getting in the car.
no,
I mean, you can.
you got
But
to have
it's
a bike and one of
inhospitable and
those.
it takes fucking forever.
Yeah. I mean, even you're only a few blocks away from a grocery store.
It's a half mile.
Is it? Okay. Well, yeah. Like you'd, in order to make it worth your while, you'd have to pack up a trailer to your bike, ride your bike down there, load it up with as many things as you could fit, and hope that you didn't have to go back in the next few days. Like it's pretty. It's
It
pretty
is an
atrocious.
option. I'm not saying we don't, but like my kid's school, right?
Yeah.
By virtue of having to share custody and like drop them off.
Yeah. It's
Like,
not like they can go to.
And there's not enough. It's not safe enough really to bike. And even if I did, and I was able to put 2 kids on bike, they're too big for a trailer, right?
Yeah.
And now, so I have kids riding with me on roads that are that aren't maintained.
Isn't that like
no money to maintain them because the cops take all the fucking city money.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and you're right on what, a
5 miles
lane?
away, so it's not like they can just walk there. Sorry, go ahead.
And you're right on a 5-lane road. Is that right?
If you count the chicken lane.
I do. Yeah, that's pretty terrible.
5 lanes if you count the chicken lane.
Yeah. In this household, we count the chicken lane.
One thing I do like about this is how fucking obscure these guys get. I forgot. I said he was a social philosopher. He is a Marxist philosopher. Okay. But they talks about the Grundrisse or whatever, which is a publication. I believe that was from here it is 1857.
Okay.
How many years ago was that now?
175, 65, 175, 65. Yeah.
165.
Yeah. And we've failed to establish any of these ideas anywhere in the world for more than a few minutes.
There he was. So 170 fucking years ago, we understood.
Mm-hmm.
That,
unfortunately, so did the people in charge, and they knew that they wouldn't be in charge anymore if it were allowed to pass.
Capitalism drives us.
Yeah. I watched a good video about how.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
I watched a good video about how it's hard to imagine anything other than capitalism because it's insinuated itself into every aspect of life. And so,
yeah, it's not just an economic system, as I heard someone mention the other day. It's like a system of social control. Right. Like it permeates our brains and shit. Yeah. But it's just interesting that we've known for so long that like the system has a problem of overaccumulation, and we were just talking about how insane suburbia is, right? And all these problems it's causing us now as energy and materials to build cars, etc., so forth. We have a very complex system with complex supply chains, and also the raw materials needed to produce these things are becoming scarcer and harder to get due to instability in, transportation
Everywhere.
or in labor or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And suburbia itself, speaking of this crisis of overaccumulation, economic planners before even the end of World War II were terrified that when the war ended, like we were going to be plunged back into a depression because the system really only worked with the kind of level of employment and the kind of consumption of raw materials and energy that it takes to wage a fucking total war across an ocean,
Right.
or across two oceans, technically.
Yep.
Right. So, the whole suburban project, the interstate highway system, all of this fucking build these, cookie cutter fucking timber stick frame subdivisions and all this shit was all coming out of economic planners being like, oh shit, like we have to do something to maintain the level of consumption of raw materials and energy, because when this war is over, we're fucked. And what else did we do? We had a massive stockpile of weapons because we were just building them like we were going to be at war forever.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, Russia makes it to fucking Berlin, right?
Yep.
And then shortly thereafter, the UK and US soldiers made it to Berlin, and the war in Europe was over, right? Mussolini was hanged or whatever, all that shit. So what did we do with all the bombs we had because of World War II?
Sold them off to other people. No?
No. We fucking bombed North Korea.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, we fucking transitioned
absolute
immediately into the Korean War.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Didn't
right
miss a
away.
fucking beat.
We had all these fucking weapons we had to do something with.
Yeah.
And guess what? Like, everybody that's like, oh, the North Koreans are fucking crazy. Let's just try and put ourselves in someone else's shoes, because as a lefty, I want to be empathetic and want to understand other people's perspectives. It's a country that was like absolutely fucking obliterated by US bombs.
Yep.
Absolutely massacred people. I don't even have the numbers, but I know that it was really bad, and we never fucking talk about it.
Yeah.
The Korean War gets Vietnam does, because of the social movements and other kinds of things, and also how fucking long it was. But Korea's like the forgotten conflict. And I think there's actually a book on the Korean War called The Forgotten War or whatever, something like that. Something we don't talk about, but that was, again, a way to expend this over-accumulated surplus, to throw them into the proverbial ocean of human lives in Korea, right? Like,
yeah.
Against North Koreans who kind of, I don't really know much about the conflict, but I think it was similar to Vietnam in the sense that they were like communist factions that were vying for political power.
And you can't
so
have
we
that.
Stepped in on behalf of the bourgeois interests.
Yeah.
To crush communism.
So we'd have markets to sell.
Yeah.
It's just basically to establish markets. 5 million, by the way. More
5
than
million
half,
people died?
More than half non-combatants.
More than half of the people died were non-combatants.
Yeah.
Of the total population?
Total population, yeah. It said more than half of these, about 10% of Korea's pre-war population, were civilians. So 25 million people total, it sounds like. If my math is right.
People.
Yeah, like 25.
It might create some bad blood.
Maybe they might not, like the country which did that. And maybe we could all understand that. I think if we were to be bombed to hell, I mean, hell, we still don't like the British, and that was fucking 200 and some odd years ago. They didn't really even do all that much.
It's true.
I mean, we like their baking shows, but that's about it.
Stop. All right, I think we've reached the end of this.
And with that.
Yeah, so again, here's weapons are going there to neo-Nazis through this conflict.
Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of other dimensions of why we want to be in a proxy war with Russia, et cetera, so forth. But ultimately, when it boils down to it, we need war.
Yeah.
one thing that I think was not mentioned here is like we got to have the weapons, have the war, but it's also the rebuilding, right?
Contractors, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Afghanistan. Western contractors come in, secure a whole bunch of deals, build a whole bunch of shit. They build bases there too. Like there's money to be made in every aspect of war. Yes, I know you're aware.
As a
You lived on
contractor,
one. You lived on one.
who's mildly complicit.
Yeah.
But as I said before I went, I was like, dude, people have been here for 8 years before me, and they'll be here after I'm gone.
And there's always room.
That
for
wasn't
regret.
necessary.
Yeah. Well, there's always room for regret. You do you take your action for your own reasons, and only in hindsight, do you really have the time to analyze it and come to regret it. I mean,
yeah, regret's not a word I would use.
Mm-hmm.
But I do acknowledge that that was my only pathway to home ownership.
Yeah.
And so when I'm like, I have an affordable mortgage and I consider myself lucky, I mean, I did sacrifice. I basically missed an entire year of my daughter's life, or more than a year of my daughter's life.
Yeah.
And got fucking all sorts of fucked up shit rocket shot at me. I was talking about earlier. I wouldn't have been able to buy a house otherwise. So
yeah.
And I didn't create that world. I would much rather have a world where we had social housing.
Yeah, as it should be. Oh well.
Yep.
In the meantime, we'll just have young boys screwing up their lives in order to get scraps.
Yeah, exactly, and being fucking angry and
nowadays
all sorts of military equipment.
Hey, and nowadays, thanks to the wokeness of America, young women too.
Yes. Speaking of which, I think we're going to do a show on wokeness.
Yeah. Maybe it revolves around Star Wars.
I think it was going to be part of our discussion of Andor, because Andor is by far the wokest fucking Star Wars ever. Which is interesting because people that whined and complained about Disney Star Wars just being too woke and they're ruining Star Wars with all this woke bullshit. Andor is absolutely hands down the wokest fucking Star Wars ever, and everybody loves it.
Yeah.
So the reality is, it's not that Star Wars was woke was your problem. It's a bad fucking writing and poor execution. So instead of adopting all this, going into your 4chan and making fucking memes about Mary Sue's and shit, and how women shouldn't be in charge of Star Wars and they shouldn't be acting in Star Wars, right?
Which is I've seen it all, dude. Leia. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. Only if she's in a gold bikini getting licked by the Godfather, right?
Priorities.
Yeah, and everybody that said that, really, when it boils down to it, is either Andor is so fucking smart and you're so stupid that you can't see it, or your complaint, you were using that as a proxy for your real complaint because you could not articulate this show was poorly written, poorly acted. Some of the acting was okay, but poorly written, poorly executed from a production standpoint, from an editing standpoint, but primarily from a writing standpoint.
Yeah, so much so that the last one didn't make any fucking sense, but that's okay.
It's funny. I've watched and this will all see. That's why we got to learn how to clip too. We've and this will be my last point before we do our little sign off, unless you got one. But I've watched every Star Wars movie dozens of times.
Mm-hmm.
And even The Phantom Menace, which is not a great movie. It really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
I've even watched that a bunch of times. I tried to watch The Rise of Skywalker a second time. And I wound up finishing it, but it took me 6 fucking days because I'd watch for 10 minutes and be like, oh, I can't do this.
Go cry into your hand.
Yeah. Just, oh, God.
What did you do?
I'm a fan of The Last Jedi. That'll have to come up in Andor. We'll talk about why I'm a fan of The Last Jedi, because everybody fucking hated that movie. And I think it was just fanboys that just wanted an uber powerful fucking Luke Skywalker pulling Star Destroyers out of the sky and shit. And instead they had gone a direction where he was a much more believable character instead of a superhero. And people were fucking mad about that. They hated that fucking movie. But I've rewatched that one a bunch of times because it has rewatchability. Whereas The Rise of Skywalker, you're like, this is fucking incoherent. Like,
Why was
what do you
the
mean?
dagger down with the animal? I don't understand it.
Yeah, why? Okay, so we're only talking about, what was it, 20 years, 25 years?
Yeah.
That they're like, oh, we know where the Wayfinder is in the second Death Star that's now like a ruin in this middle of this ocean, not the middle of the ocean, but off the shore here in the ocean. We know it's there. We're gonna craft a fucking dagger. And then we're gonna write like in an ancient tongue that no one knows but C-3PO, but he's not allowed to read it. So we have to go.
No, stop! You're giving me a headache.
It made no fucking sense.
No, it's so
J.J.
contrived.
Abrams is
It's
the
super
problem, not
contrived,
Rian Johnson.
and-
I hope they give him latitude, but stay away from legacy characters, dude.
Yeah, give us
Because
new
we
shit.
don't need all those stories. We didn't need a Han Solo preview, but even that movie is kind of as bad as it was. It wasn't great. It's still fun. I can watch that when I just want like some catharsis and be like, I just want to watch a fun movie.
So that's how
Like-
he got those dice.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's how he met fucking Chewbacca. It's like, oh, that's how the Millennium Falcon became the fastest ship in the game. But it's fun and the pacing's okay, and like we didn't need it. But either way, stay away from legacy characters and give Rian Johnson like one of these things. Like, you got Acolyte coming up. They got this weird one with Jude Law. I don't know how they fucking cast him, called Skeleton Crew, which I think fits within the Filoni verse. So it's the Skeleton Crew is gonna be tied to Ahsoka in some way or whatever.
Oh, okay.
But give Rian Johnson some kind of obscure story that takes place in some sector of the galaxy in some unimportant period, and let him tell a fucking story that he wants. Because I want to see
Corporate sector
what he would do.
authority.
What's
Gimme,
that?
gimme. Corporate sector authority. Gimme, gimme, gimme.
Yeah, Andor kind of tried to touch on a little of that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where Ferrix was located, but it could have been in the corporate sector.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know.
I would have to look it up, but I mean, a lot of the
Well, it's
stuff
a
they
new
touched
planet,
on, I was
right?
like,
They created it for
ooh.
the show.
Most likely, they keep creating new ones, even though they have old ones. I mean, it's smart, it's stupid at the same time, but it did smack of corporate sector authority, levels of holding people down, and it makes sense because it really was like, oh, we have these local, law enforcement agencies that we're just kind of outsourcing to, and so it makes sense. But we've probably gone far enough off topic.
We have, and this has been a really good stream. I think it came together well. I think the narrative, the through line of this was coherent.
Yes, hopefully everyone
In a way
agrees
that
with it,
sometimes
that we're getting better at this.
We're getting better. We're getting our sea legs.
Yes.
Now, if only the U.S. government can, we can just start a proxy war with Russia, and they can send us their fucking boats and helicopters and shit. We'll be just fine.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fun. Let's double our efforts and speak out whenever possible against sending. But first of all, building weapons and the war economy, the permanent war economy, but also especially sending munitions to a country that has a bad track record for keeping their fucking weapons within state control. And let's try and make sure that we're not funding a bunch of Nazis and arming a bunch of fucking Nazis and other extremists. But ultimately, this is kind of what happens, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the process of how it works. This is how we get, violent conflicts, and it's all related. And this is ultimately, part of the transition to warlordism that will characterize the coming dark age, because when liberty dies, it dies
With thunderous applause. It's a great one.
Have a good one,
See you
buddy.
all next week, Andor.
Andor next week. Peace.
Later.
All right.